The check was still sealed. 7 figures. Certified.
It sat on the white marble of the kitchen island, heavier than any merger document Julian Thorne had ever signed. It was the weight of an asset he had acquired, meticulously planned, and then lost, not to a rival bidder, but to a silent rejection.
Julian Thorne existed in a universe where everything had a price tag and a definitive closing date.
He was 38 years old, the principal architect of Thorne Capital, a man who measured his life by annualized returns and the absolute silence of his private office, 20 floors above Central Park. Control was not a luxury. It was the mechanism of his existence. He controlled the market, his schedule, his diet, and most crucially, the public perception of Julian Thorne. Lately, that perception had demanded adjustment. The media narrative was shifting from ruthless tycoon to emotionally vacant. For the forthcoming IPO of his new tech venture, he needed ballast. He needed warmth. He needed a woman who looked genuine, but required no actual emotional investment. He did not believe in love. Love, to Julian, was a biological weakness, an unstable variable that compromised optimization. He approached the solution with corporate precision. Through a high-end, extremely discreet agency, one that specialized in social solutions, he found Eliza Vance.
Eliza was 26. She possessed an angular, classic beauty and, more importantly, an air of quiet gravity.
She wasn't an actress. She was a struggling student of historical preservation with immediate, crushing debt, a detail Julian's team had verified thoroughly. Her need was financial, immediate, and high stakes. The perfect transactional candidate.
The contract was clear, drawn up by 3 layers of corporate counsel, 6 months, 10 public appearances, 5 private dinners with key investors, 1 trip to Davos. Compensation, the amount sitting now, sealed, on his countertop.
The rules were stricter than an international treaty. No social media posts, no private contact, no lingering physical affection after the cameras were gone.
Their first public engagement was a charity gala in downtown Manhattan. Julian watched her across the polished floor beforehand. She wore the gown his stylist had selected, perfectly tailored.
She looked less like a hired accessory and more like a necessary counterweight to his sharp, dark silhouette. "Remember the narrative, Eliza," Julian stated in the black Escalade idling outside the venue. His voice was low, flat. "We met through a mutual acquaintance in the arts. A slow burn, respectful intimacy. Nothing." "I remember, Julian," she replied, her voice soft, slightly rough like old silk. She never called him Mr. That was her only contractual deviation, permitted for the sake of public intimacy. The performance began the moment the car door opened. She took his arm. Her touch was light, professional, yet utterly convincing. Julian felt a minor shift in his internal equilibrium. He was accustomed to the rigid formality of business partners. Eliza provided a malleable, comfortable structure. For 3 months, the system functioned flawlessly. Eliza was impeccable. She navigated the treacherous waters of hedge fund wives and society columnists with innate grace. She laughed in exactly the right places, listened intently when Julian was forced to speak about non-financial topics, and offered the exact level of restrained adoration necessary to soften his media profile. Julian began to relax into the arrangement. He didn't relax emotionally, but transactionally. The service she provided was worth the cost. Then, the subtle cracks began to appear. Small deviations, seemingly insignificant, that his controlled environment was not equipped to process. One evening, after a particularly grueling interview, where Julian was pressed hard on a controversial acquisition, they returned to his penthouse. The cameras were gone. His assistant, Mark, was packing up. Julian moved toward the liquor cabinet, his jaw tight. "You should drink water first," Eliza said quietly, standing by the entry. Julian paused, mid-reach for the scotch bottle. "Excuse? You clenched your jaw 7 times in the last 5 minutes of the interview. You are dehydrated. The tension will hit worse if you go straight to—" He stared at her. His personal physician had given him this advice, but it was not public knowledge. It was certainly not in the briefing materials provided to Eliza.
"That's outside the contract, Eliza," he said, keeping his tone even.
She shrugged slightly, a gesture of almost weary honesty. "It is simply an observation, Julian. Part of the value proposition, perhaps. A professional assessment of stress."
She walked past him, poured 2 glasses of filtered water, and placed one silently on the coaster nearest his chair. She then retreated to the guest suite assigned to her, closing the door softly.
Julian sat down. He drank the water. The tension in his shoulders eased. He analyzed the exchange, trying to quantify it. Was she trying to leverage closer access? Was this a veiled request for a raise? He found no discernible angle. It was simply care, a concept he had outsourced entirely, often to nutritionists and masseurs, but never encountered in its raw, unmarketable form.
The incidents continued. During a trip to Milan, Julian came down with a rapid, debilitating flu. The contract stipulated that if Julian became incapacitated, Eliza was required only to maintain a low profile until her presence was no longer required. She was certainly not required to tend to him. Yet, for 48 hours, she did. She moved through his sterile, high-tech hotel suite with the efficiency of a nurse and the quiet demeanor of a ghost. She brought him lukewarm tea, adjusted the temperature settings, and insisted he take the over-the-counter medicine.
Julian lay in bed, weak and slightly feverish, watching her move. He saw no performance. There were no cameras, no staff, just the 2 of them in the pressurized silence of extreme wealth.
"Why are you doing?" Julian asked hoarsely on the second day.
Eliza checked his temperature, her hand briefly touching his forehead, a gesture that was surprisingly grounding.
"Your staff is managing the public fallout," she said, looking straight at him, her eyes clear and brown. "But they are managing the fallout to Thorne Capital. They are not managing Julian Thorne. That seems inefficient. A breakdown in—"
Julian had no reply. He wanted to categorize her actions, maternal instinct, perhaps, or future goodwill investment, but the sheer lack of demand, the absence of any expectation of reciprocity, baffled the algorithmic logic of his mind. He was paying for a polished shell, and sometimes he received something that felt oddly organic, like finding a real pearl mixed into a shipment of flawless synthetic ones. As the 6-month term approached its conclusion, Julian began to feel an unfamiliar tension, a slight nausea that had nothing to do with corporate risk. He had become accustomed to her presence. The way she would quietly read an obscure historical text while he managed the markets at 5 a.m. The way she knew to order his dinner when he was deep in a late call, always the healthy, protein-heavy dish he preferred, without asking. It was not love. Julian was certain of that. It was the seamless integration of a perfect system upgrade. He considered renewing the contract, offering double the original sum. Not because he needed the media shield anymore. The IPO was done, successful. But because he didn't want the silence to return. The night of the final contractual obligation arrived. It was a private dinner at his penthouse, staged ostensibly to thank close friends for their support during the IPO launch, though everyone present was really just a strategic asset. Eliza was exquisite that night. She wore a simple midnight blue velvet dress. Her smile seemed softer, slightly melancholy, but her professionalism was unwavering. When the guests departed, Julian dismissed the service staff and his security detail. The apartment, usually a haven of quiet control, now felt vast and empty. He went to the safe in his study and retrieved the thick cream envelope. He placed it on the desk between them, the seal unbroken. 6 months, exactly, Julian stated, his voice tight. The performance was exceptional, Eliza. Frankly, the perception shift exceeded expectations. My gratitude is— Eliza looked at the envelope. She did not reach for it. I upheld my end, Julian, she said softly. You certainly did, and I uphold— Julian pushed the envelope closer to her. The check is inside, certified. As per the agreement, your debt should be liquidated with a significant— Eliza looked from the envelope to Julian. Her expression was completely unreadable. It lacked the professional veneer of the last 6 months. It lacked the exhaustion of the student she was. It lacked the relief of the debtor she needed to be.
I appreciate the adherence to the terms, she said slowly.
She then did something that broke the mathematical stability of Julian's world.
She reached out, but instead of taking the envelope, she gently pushed it back towards his side of the mahogany desk.
I won't be taking this.
Julian froze. His mind immediately went to litigation, to breach of contract. I don't understand. Is there an issue with the compensation? We can adjust the decimal point if necessary. I assure you liquidity is not an... It's not about the amount, she said. She stood up, smoothing the velvet fabric over her lap. The contract stated that I was compensated for my time, for my appearance, and for the narrative
She walked to the window, looking out over the silent, glittering city.
But somewhere along the way, she continued, her voice barely a whisper, I realized that the service I provided to you, the genuine part of the service, was not something that could be.
Julian felt a cold, abstract shock, like an electrical surge through non-conductive material.
Eliza, you had a significant financial requirement, he pressed, trying to invoke the transactional pressure that had brought her here. We verified the...
Yes, she agreed, turning back towards him. A slow, gentle smile touched her lips, but her eyes held a profound sadness. And the debt remains. But I learned something important here, Julian.
I learned that my self-worth is perhaps the last thing I own that cannot be purchased, even to clear an account. She paused, taking a deep breath that sounded heavy in the silent room.
If I take the money now, after everything, it feels like I'd be selling the only real moments we had. The moments when the cameras were off, when you were sick.
When you accidentally told that terrible joke about the derivatives market, and I laughed because it was genuinely sweet, not because it was in the... She looked at him, not with pity or accusation, but with a clear, devastating understanding of his deficiency. You hired me to teach the world that Julian Thorne could feel something, but you never learned the difference between buying the lesson and experiencing it. She picked up her small purse from the chair. She did not look back at the desk, at the fortune lying untouched. Thank you, Julian. She was gone. The door to the elevator chimed, the metallic sound seeming harsh and final in the luxurious stillness.
Julian did not move for an hour. He remained seated behind the desk, staring at the thick, cream-colored envelope. It was an anomaly, a glitch in the matrix of his controlled reality. Every transaction in his adult life had concluded with an exchange of quantified value. This was the first time a contract had been breached, not by failure of service, but by the rejection of payment.
He reached out and finally touched the envelope. It was cold. The next morning, his assistant, Mark, arrived and found Julian exactly where he had left him, still in the tailored suit from the night before.
Mr. Thorne, Mark began, wary of the atmosphere. I have the security logs for Miss Vance's departure. Her driver confirmed she was dropped off at her residence at 1:17 a.m. No luggage, no financial requests were.
The envelope, Julian stated, his voice dry. Where is the... Mark glanced at the desk. It's still there. Julian's mind began the tedious, agonizing process of recategorization. If she didn't take the money, then what was her motivation? If the value was not financial, it must have been emotional. And if it was emotional, then the genuine emotion she displayed was not performance. It was reality. And if that was reality, then she genuinely cared. The cold certainty of this realization hit him not as a romantic epiphany, but as a devastating logistical failure. He had been given an unparalleled, perfect gift, unsolicited, priceless, and unconditional, and he had treated it like a budgeted operational expense. He had failed to recognize the real value until the item was returned. Julian tried to find her, not to repay her. He knew now that money was the wrong instrument, but to understand the logistics of that non-transactional world she inhabited. He called the agency,
They informed him, with polite contractual finality, that Miss Vance had fulfilled her obligations, terminated her relationship with the agency, and her contact information was sealed.
Julian sent private investigators. They found her old apartment empty. They traced her financial records, confirming she had indeed begun paying off her initial debts through other, smaller, arduous means.
She had vanished into the vast, anonymous rhythm of the city, taking her quiet dignity with her. The loss was unlike anything Julian had ever experienced. It was not the loss of an asset which could be replaced, but the loss of potential, the loss of something he hadn't known he needed until the moment it was irrevocably withdrawn.
His life resumed, but the silence did not. Before Eliza, the silence of his penthouse had signified mastery and peace. Now it was a profound emptiness, a vacuum where a gentle presence used to be. Every perfectly curated dinner, every tailored suit, every cold, successful morning felt tainted by the fact that he was the man who had paid 7 figures to push away the only real warmth he had ever been offered.
He tried dating again. He went out with women of impeccable breeding and impressive careers. They were smart, ambitious, and understood the rules of the high-stakes game. But when the restaurant noise faded and they were alone in the car, Julian found himself waiting for the non-contractual observation, the quiet correction, the laugh that meant nothing to the public, but everything to the truth. It never came. The new women were exactly what they appeared to be, transactional partners operating on a high-cost social contract. They wanted status, security, or alliance. Julian realized he had become permanently disqualified from true connection. He was forever listening for the sound of a genuine, unpaid emotion, and since he had already rejected the perfect instance of it, everything else sounded like a bad performance. He could not escape the memory of the sealed envelope, the symbol of his profound failure to recognize the priceless. Julian Thorne did not transform into a sudden romantic. He was still a man defined by structure and control, but he redirected that formidable control. 2 years after Eliza vanished, Julian Thorne launched the Vance Historical Preservation Fund. The focus was narrow, specific, providing full scholarships and financial assistance to graduate students pursuing advanced degrees in overlooked historical studies, exactly Eliza's field. The fund was massive, endowed with an initial amount triple the check she had refused. Julian oversaw every detail. The application process was rigorous. The mission statement was precise. He never spoke publicly about the fund's namesake. When journalists inquired, his official line was always the same, a quiet recognition of the inherent value in non-commercial. It was a monument to his regret, a massive, permanent accounting entry for the emotional debt he could never repay. He had built a fortress of money around the one person who refused to take it, preserving her ghost in the very system he had used to try and buy her. Julian Thorne continued to run his empire, ruthlessly and successfully. He never married. He never risked love again, because he understood that love was the one asset you could not command, liquidate, or quantify. And he knew, with chilling clarity, that the cost of hiring love was simply the price of realizing you didn't know how to receive it when it was offered for free. He had his chance. He sealed it in an envelope.
He kept the check. It remained in the large fireproof safe in his study, a stark white rectangle resting under the signed acquisition documents and the gold reserves. It served as a daily reminder. 7 figures, worthless.
Sometimes, late at night, when the city was quiet, he would open the safe, look at the check, and touch the pristine surface of the paper. It was the only contract in his life that ended with the silence of acceptance, not the sound of a pen. Julian Thorne understood the market, but he died never understanding the currency of the human heart. He often wondered if Eliza Vance ever saw the Vance Fund. He hoped she was happy, pursuing her passion, free of the financial burdens that had briefly placed her in his calculated orbit. He hoped she never needed to sell her time again. But he never looked for her.
not truly. Because Julian Thorne knew if he found her, he would be forced to face the overwhelming reality that the man she cared for was the successful businessman, the patient who needed water, the man who made a bad joke, not the wealthy tycoon who sat alone in the silence, staring at a debt he could finally afford to pay, but was forever prohibited from settling.
The question remains, what happens to the kind of man who achieves absolute financial control only to discover that the purest form of human connection is fundamentally resistant to the laws of supply and demand?
Join us next time as we explore the story of Charlotte Reed, the Silicon Valley prodigy who built her entire career on a lie of omission, only to watch her empire collapse when the person she protected the secret from decided that silence was no longer a viable form of payment.
You will not want to miss the precise moment she realizes that leverage works two ways.